Trial of Theodorus and others for treason at Antioch. While Valens was at Antioch, free for the moment from anxiety about his foreign foes, he narrowly escaped death from domestic treachery, as the following account will make clear. A restless character called Procopius, who was always keen to make trouble, charged two courtiers, Anatolius and Spudasius, who had been summoned to pay amounts of which they had defrauded the treasury, with an attempt on the life of Count Fortunatian, who was notoriously oppressive in pursuing such claims. This maddened Fortunatian, a man of naturally choleric temper, and in accordance with the rules defining his authority, he handed over to the court of the Praetorian prefect a man of the lowest origin called Palladius, who he alleged had been ordered to poison him by the aforesaid courtiers, together with a reader of horoscopes called Heliodorus, in order that they might be forced to reveal what they knew of the matter. In the course of a strict investigation of the crime or attempted crime, Palladius had the effrontery to assert that the point at issue was trivial and negligible. If he were allowed to speak, he would tell of a more monumentous and fearful plot for which elaborate preparations had been made, and which, unless precautions were taken, would create universal havoc. He was offered immunity in return for his information and proceeded to unroll a long string of charges to the effect that the ex-governor Fiducius, together with Pergamius and Irenaeus, had used the abominable art of divination in secret to discover the name of Valens' successor. Fiducius, who happened to be about, was at once seized and privately examined. When he was confronted by the informer, he made no attempt to deny or conceal what had already been disclosed, but revealed the details of the whole sinister affair. He admitted unreservedly that with the assistance of Hilarius and Patricius, who were adepts at divination, the former had held a post in the administration. He had held a séance about the succession, and that the outcome of their inquiries was a prediction that an excellent prince would be named, but that the inquirers themselves would come to a sad end. They discussed who there was at that time of outstanding character, and came to the conclusion that the best of all was Theodorus. He had already risen to the second place among the notaries, and was in fact just such a man as they thought him. He came of an old and distinguished family in Gaul, had received a liberal education from his earliest boyhood, and was highly regarded for his moderation, wisdom, refinement, charm, and learning. He always seemed too good for the office or rank he was holding, and was the favourite of high and low alike. His was almost the only mouth which could not be shut for fear of consequences, though he kept a bridle on his tongue and never spoke without reflection. After being tortured almost to death, Fiducius added that he had informed Theodorus of these predictions through the agency of Eusebius. The latter was a man of remarkable literary attainments and highly thought of, who had recently governed Asia as pro-prefect. He was arrested, and the record of the proceedings was read to the emperor in the usual way. The result was that the monstrous ferocity of Valens spread everywhere like a blazing fire, and was fed by the shameful flattery of many of his court, in particular of Modestrus, the Praetorian prefect. This man was racked with daily increasing anxiety about the succession, and though he veiled his skilful adulation by covertly sneering at Valens, who was something of a dunce, used various devices to win his favour. He called his rough, crude language Ciceronian flowers of speech, and flattered his vanity by promising that the very stars could be made to shine if Valens commanded it. In consequence, orders were given that Theodorus should be brought with all speed from Constantinople, which he was visiting on private business. While he was on the way, various preliminary inquiries were pursued day and night, which resulted in many people of high rank and birth being fetched from widely separated places. The public prisons were full to overflowing, and even when private houses were requisitioned, the numbers under arrest could not be properly lodged. They were confined in crowded and stifling conditions, most of them in chains and all in fear for their own fate and that of their relatives. At last Theodorus himself arrived, dressed in mourning and as good as dead. He was kept in a remote part of the territory of Antioch, and when everything was ready for the coming trials, it was as if a trumpet sounded to herald domestic disaster. Since it is as misleading knowingly to conceal facts as it is to invent fictitious incidents, I do not deny the undisputed truth that the life of Valens, which had often before been the object of conspiracies, was now plunged into extreme danger. The military had a sword almost at his throat, and it was turned aside only by destiny, which was reserving him for deplorable disasters in Thrace. While he was enjoying a quiet afternoon nap in a wooded spot between Antioch and Seleucia, he was attacked by the targeteer Solustius, and many attempts were made on his life at other times. He escaped these monstrous outrages only because he had not yet completed the span of life allotted to him at birth. The same thing often happened in the reign of Commodus and Severus, whose lives were frequently attempted with great violence. The former, after surviving many domestic dangers, received an almost fatal dagger wound from the hand of the senator Quintinian, a man of lawless ambition, as he was traversing a passage in the amphitheatre to attend the games. The latter, at the very end of his life, was surprised in his bed by the centurion Saturninus, at the instigation of the prefect Plautian, and would have been stabbed if he had not been rescued by his young son. Valens therefore had every reason to take precautions to preserve his life, which traitors were eager to take from him. What was inexcusable was that in his tyrannical pride he maliciously pursued and prosecuted innocent and guilty alike under one and the same law, without making any distinction between their deserts. While the charge was still unproved, the emperor had decided upon the sentence, and some learned that they had been condemned before they knew that they were suspected. His own greed and that of his courtiers acted as a spur to this rigid policy. They were always opening their mouths for fresh gains, and on the rare occasions when mercy was suggested they called it slackness. The flattery of these bloodsuckers fatally corrupted the character of a man who had death at the tip of his tongue, and the untimely storm which they raised in their haste to destroy the richest houses blew down everything. Valens had two fatal defects, which put him at the mercy of intriguers. He was liable to intolerable fits of rage just at the moment when he should have been ashamed to be angry, and his princely pride did not allow him to sift the truth of what he allowed people to whisper to him in the freedom of private conversation. He took it all as true and certain. As a result, many people were thrust from their homes by what purported to be an act of mercy, and were driven headlong into exile. Their property was collected by the treasury and used by the emperor for his own purposes, while the condemned were ground down by fearful poverty and reduced to beg for their bread, a fate which the wise old poet Theogenes advised us to avoid if necessary by hurling ourselves into the sea. Even if one allows that these decisions were just, the severity with which they were executed was hateful. It has been truly observed that no sentence is more cruel than one which veils its harshness under an appearance of mercy. When the notables, to whom the conduct of these trials was entrusted, had assembled under the presidency of the praetorian prefect, the racks were set up, and leaden weights, cords, and scourges put in readiness. The air was filled with the appalling yells of savage voices, mixed with the clanking of chains, as the torturers in the execution of their grim task shouted, "Hold, bind, tighten, yet more." The victims that I have seen hauled away after agonizing torments are so numerous that everything is confused in my recollection, and I am left in the dark. Since the details of all that happened escape me, I will give a brief account of what my memory retains. After a few preliminaries, Pergamius was brought in first. He, as I said, had been betrayed by Palladius for inquiring into the future by the forbidden practice of sorcery. He was a fluent speaker and liable to endanger people by letting his tongue run away with him. While the judges were debating the order of their interrogation, he burst boldly into speech, pouring out an endless list of accessories and demanding that some people should be fetched from the ends of the earth to stand trial on serious charges. This was setting the court too hard a task, and he was punished with death. After him others were executed in droves, until at last the case of Theodorus was reached, the Olympic event, so to speak, which crowned the series. The same day saw the following sad event among many others. Selaia, who shortly before had been Count of the Treasury in Thrace, was being brought from prison to be tried and was just putting his foot into his shoe when he collapsed suddenly under the stress of overwhelming terror and breathed his last in the arms of his guards. The court was constituted, and the judges announced the rules which were to govern the procedure. But in the event, they manipulated the outcome of the cases in accordance with the wishes of their master. This caused universal horror. Valens had entirely abandoned the path of equity and learned the trade of persecution, so he broke out into the most furious anger, like a wild beast in the arena when anyone who has come near its place of work has escaped. Patricius and Hilarius were brought in and told to give a full account of what had occurred. Their first statements differed a little, but after a savage flogging and the production of the tripod, which was their instrument, they were reduced to such straits that they revealed the truth of the whole business from the beginning. Hilarius spoke first. "My lords, in an unlucky moment we put together out of laurel twigs in the shape of the Delphic tripod the hapless little table before you. We consecrated it with cryptic spells and a long series of magical rites, and at last made it work. The way in which it did so when we wished to consult it about hidden matters was this. It was placed in the middle of a room thoroughly fumigated with spices from Arabia, and was covered with a round dish made from an alloy of various metals. The outer rim of the dish was cunningly engraved with the 24 letters of the alphabet separated by accurately measured intervals. A man dressed in linen garments and wearing linen sandals, with a fillet round his head and green twigs from a lucky tree in his hand, officiated as a priest. After uttering a set prayer to invoke the divine power which presides over prophecy, he took his place above the tripod, as his knowledge of the proper ritual had taught him, and set swinging a ring, suspended by a very fine cotton thread, which had been consecrated by a mystical formula. The ring, moving in a series of jumps over the marked spaces, came to rest on particular letters which made up hexameters appropriate to the questions put and perfect in scansion and rhythm, like the lines produced at Delphi or by the oracle of the Branchidae. On this occasion, when we asked who would succeed the present emperor, We had already learnt that whoever it was would be excellent in every way. The ring lightly touched the letters marking the 2 syllables Theo, and when it came to the following letter, one of those present cried out that the finger of fate inevitably pointed to Theodorus. So we left the matter there, being entirely satisfied that he was the man we were looking for. After putting the whole affair before the court in so clear a light, Hilarius was good enough to add that Theodorus was entirely ignorant of it all. He and Patricius were next asked whether the method of sorcery they had used with such confidence had foretold their own present sufferings. In reply they uttered the notorious lines which clearly foretold that this act of inquiring into the supernatural would be fatal to those who engaged in it, but that nevertheless the Furies breathing fire and slaughter were in wait also for the Emperor himself and his judges. Of these lines it will be enough to quote the last 3. Your blood shall be avenged, Tisiphone, for them too has an evil fate in store, when Ares waxes wrath on Mimius' plain. After reciting these lines, both the accused were fearfully mangled by the torturer's hooks, and taken away unconscious. Later, in order to expose the whole machinery of the projected crime, a group of men of rank were put on trial. These comprised the actual heads of the conspiracy. Each thought only of his own safety and tried to shift his own ruin onto another, until finally, by permission of the court, Theodorus began to speak. At first he lay prostrate begging for pardon, but when he was forced to come more to the point, he declared that when he heard of the matter through Eusebius, he made several attempts to report it to the emperor. Eusebius, however, had prevented this by assuring him that what they were waiting for would not come about by an unlawful bid to usurp the throne, but by the inevitable working of fate. Eusebius, when interrogated under torture, confirmed this statement, but Theodorus was convicted by a letter of his own to Hilarius. Its terms were indirect and tortuous, but its purport was that Theodorus, encouraged by the prediction, felt no hesitation about the matter, and was only waiting for the right moment to attain his desire. When these facts were established, the accused were removed, and Eutropius, who then held the proconsular post of governor of Asia, was charged with complicity in the plot. But he was rescued by the philosopher Pasiphilus, and escaped unharmed. Pasiphilus was cruelly tortured to induce him to ruin Eutropius by false evidence, but all effort to overcome his stubborn resistance failed. There was also another philosopher called Simonides, who was still quite young, but a man of the strictest principles I have ever known. He was accused of having heard of the plot through Fiducius. Realizing that the outcome of the trial would not depend on the truth but on the will of a single man, he said that he had heard of the prediction, but felt bound as a man of honour to keep the secret. After scrutinizing all these matters with a keen eye, the judges consulted the emperor. In response, he issued a comprehensive decree for the execution of all of the accused. In the presence of a countless throng which could hardly view the fearful sight without a shudder, and which filled the air with lament, since the sufferings of individuals seemed likely to be the common fate, they were all brought out and pitifully beheaded. The single exception was Simonides. The author of this savage sentence had been maddened by his unshakable firmness and commanded him to be burned alive. Simonides, however, to whom death was an escape from the grim tyrant we call life, and who laughed at sudden disastrous turns of fate, stood unmoved amid the flames, like the famous philosopher Pergrinius, nicknamed Proteus. He, having decided to leave the world, mounted a pyre which he had built himself at the quinquennial celebration of the Olympic Games, and was consumed by fire when the whole of Greece looked on. In the days following the execution of Simonides, a crowd of people of all ranks, who had been caught in the same snare of slander, and whom it would be a hard task to enumerate by name, gave the arms of the executioners no rest, after their strength had first been exhausted by rack, lead, and scourge. Some were put to death without a moment's delay, while the question of their guilt was still being debated, and the whole scene resembled a slaughterhouse. The innumerable books and whole heaps of documents which had been rooted out from various houses were piled up and burned under the eyes of the judges. They were treated as forbidden texts, to allay the indignation caused by the executions, though most of them were treatises on various liberal arts and on jurisprudence. Not very long afterwards, Maximus, a famous philosopher with a great reputation for learning, from whose fruitful discourses the Emperor Julian acquired such a store of knowledge, was accused of having heard the lines of this same oracle. He admitted that he had heard them, but had kept them to himself out of professional etiquette. He added, however, that he had volunteered the prediction that those who consulted the oracle would themselves perish at the hands of the executioner. He was taken to his native city of Ephesus and beheaded, learning by this last fatal experience that an unjust judge is worse than any accusation. Diogenes too was entrapped by a wicked lie. He was a man of noble stock and outstanding ability combined with great eloquence and charm, who had once been governor of Bithynia. He was put to death so that his ample estate might be plundered. Worse still, the arm of iniquity stretched so far that even Alypius, the ex-governor of Britain, a gentle and amiable man who was living quietly in retirement, was plunged into extreme misery and accused with his son Hierocles, a young man of good character, of practising sorcery. The only evidence came from a low creature also called Diogenes, who was mangled mercilessly to cause him to utter what the emperor, who was the real author of the charge, wished to hear. When there was nothing of Diogenes left to torture, he was burned alive. Alypius had his property confiscated and was condemned to exile, but recovered his son, who was reprieved by a stroke of luck after being actually led out to suffer a miserable death. Further trials for magic and treason in the East. During all these times, Palladius, the fomenter of all these troubles, who, as I said earlier, had been arrested by Fortunian and whose mean condition led him to stop at nothing, piled one disaster on another and caused universal grief and tears, having once got the chance of naming who he liked, whatever their station in life, as dabblers in forbidden arts. He entangled many people in his fatal snares like an expert hunter following the obscure track of his prey. Some he charged with having disgraced themselves by the practice of magic, some with being accessory to the treasonable ambition of others. Even wives were left no time to bewail the misfortunes of their husbands. Men were sent immediately to seal up their houses, and, in the course of examining the possessions of the condemned pater familias, to smuggle in among them old wives' spells and absurd love charms designed to endanger innocent folk. When these were read in court, where no law or scruple or sense of justice prevailed to distinguish truth from falsehood, young and old were indiscriminately deprived of their property without any opportunity of defence, although they were quite guiltless, and after suffering wholesale torture were taken off in litters to execution. The result was that throughout the eastern provinces whole libraries were burnt by their owners for fear of a similar fate. Such was the terror which seized all hearts. In a word, we all crept about at that time in a Cimmerian darkness, filled with the same fear as the guests of Dionysus of Sicily. while they were stuffing themselves with a meal more dreadful than any degree of hunger, swords hung over their heads, suspended by horsehairs from the ceiling of the room in which they were sitting, and kept them in a state of continual fear. At this time, too, Bassian, a man of distinguished family, and a notary of the highest class, was charged with attempting to obtain foreknowledge of matters beyond his sphere, though he maintained that the inquiries were merely about the sex of a child that his wife was expecting. The influence exerted by his relations saved him from death, but he was stripped of his inherited wealth. While so much was crashing in ruin, Heliodorus, the hellish contriver with Palladius of all this misery, and himself by popular report an astrologer, who had been induced by secret overtures from the court to pledge his services, put out his deadly fangs. Every kind of flattery and cajolery was employed to induce him to reveal what he knew, or had fabricated. He was solicitously pampered with the choicest meals, and large sums of money were contributed for him to bestow on his whores. His twisted features were to be seen here, there, and everywhere, an object of universal dread, and his confidence was enhanced because in his capacity of chamberlain he had free access to the women's quarters, which he visited as he pleased, displaying warrants from the father of his people which were to bring many to grief. By the emperor's means, Palladius was instructed like an advocate at the bar in what to put at the beginning of a speech in order to ensure success, and in what rhetorical figures to employ to achieve a brilliant effect. It would be tedious to narrate all the exploits of this gallows bird, but I will give one example of the way in which his bold-faced impudence shook the patriciate to its very foundations. His secret confabulations with courtiers had, as I said, made him outrageously arrogant, and he was so worthless that there was no crime he could not be hired to commit. He accused that admirable pair of consuls, the brothers Eusebius and Hypatius, connections by marriage of the former emperor Constantius, of planning to exalt themselves and of using divination to further their designs on the empire. And to make this fabrication more plausible, he added that imperial robes had actually been got ready for Eusebius. All this was eagerly swallowed by the dangerous lunatic, whose belief in his right to commit any wrong showed him to be unfit to wield authority of any kind. Anyone whom the informer, who was free from all legal restraint, had the sublime assurance to assert ought to be sent for, was inexorably hailed even from the furthest corners of the empire, and the emperor ordered a trial on a criminal charge to be set in motion. For a long time justice was tightly bound and trampled underfoot, while the abandoned scoundrel persisted in his string of falsehoods. But severe torture failed to extort a confession, and merely demonstrated that the distinguished defendants were utterly devoid of any guilty knowledge. Nevertheless, their false accuser continued to be treated with the same respect as before, while they were visited with exile and pecuniary penalties. Shortly afterwards, however, their fines were remitted, and they were recalled to the unimpaired enjoyment of their rank and dignity. Even after these deplorable proceedings, Valens' behaviour showed no more restraint or sense of shame than before. Excessive power leaves no room for the thought that a man of sound principles should not plunge wittingly into wrongdoing, even in order to inflict harm on his enemies, and that nothing is uglier than supreme authority combined with a cruel nature. When Heliodorus died, whether from natural causes or violence I would not like to say, and I could wish that the circumstances did not speak for themselves. His funeral was marshalled by the undertakers, and several men of rank, including the 2 consular brothers, were ordered to precede the corpse dressed in mourning. This act of stupidity clearly revealed the utter rottenness of the emperor's rule. Although he was earnestly entreated to refrain from inflicting such an irreparable insult, nothing could move him. He was as deaf as if he had blocked his ears with wax to sail past the rocks of the Sirens. All that could be wrung from him was the great concession that they should accompany the unhallowed bier of the sacrilegious wreath bare-handed and barefoot, and that certain persons should precede the body with clasped hands. One shudders to think of the humiliation inflicted during this period of mourning on so many men of the highest distinction, and especially on the ex-consuls, who had been honoured with the rods of office and robes of state, and won for themselves a place in the history of the world. Conspicuous among them was my fellow countryman Hypatius, whose noble qualities had earned him praise from his earliest youth. He was a man of calm and cool judgment, whose mild and honourable character never deviated from the upright. His career gave fresh lustre to his distinguished forebears, and the admirable way in which he administered his 2 prefectures conferred fame on his posterity. At this same time, it must be counted among Valens' other glorious exploits that, although in other cases he was so implacably cruel that he could hardly bear that the torments he inflicted should be terminated by death, he spared Numerius, a man of incomparable wickedness. Numerius was convicted on his own confession of cutting open the womb of a living woman and removing her embryo child in pursuit of a design to raise the dead, and questioned them about a change in the empire. But Valens looked on him with a friendly eye, and in spite of the murmurs of all classes, let him go free, and keep not only his life, but his enviable wealth and his rank in the service. How happy are they on whom heaven has bestowed the glorious gift of wisdom, which has often ennobled even vicious natures. How much might have been put right in those dark days if Valens had been taught by wisdom the lesson of the philosophers that sovereign power is nothing if it does not care for the welfare of others, and that it is the task of a good ruler to keep his power in check, to resist the passions of unbridled desire and implacable rage, and to realise that, as the dictator Caesar used to say, the recollections of past cruelty are a wretched provision for old age. If a ruler is going to pass judgment on the life and existence of a man, who is part of the world and makes up the number of living beings, he ought to reflect long and earnestly, and not be carried away by passion to commit an act that cannot be undone. Of this truth there is a well-known instance in ancient times. A woman of Smyrna confessed before Dolabella, the proconsul of Asia, that she had poisoned her husband and her son, because she had discovered that they had murdered another son of hers by a previous husband. She was remanded for 2 days, and then, because the body to which the matter was referred was in doubt where to draw the line between revenge and crime, she was sent before the Archopagus, the strict Athenian court, which is said to have decided disputes even between the gods. After hearing the case, the Areopagus decided that she should appear before it again in 100 years' time, so as to escape the dilemma of either absolving a poisoner or punishing a person who had avenged her kindred. People think that that never comes too late, which is the last of all things. Such were the iniquitous deeds committed and the shameful marks of torture branded on the bodies of free men, even if they managed to survive. But the sleepless eye of justice, the eternal witness and judge of all things, was ever on the watch. The curses uttered by the victims with their dying breaths were so plainly justified that they roused the eternal Godhead and kindled the flames of war, thus confirming the truth of the oracle which had foretold that no crime would go unpunished. The events which I have described created a widespread internal trouble at Antioch during a lull in the Parthian storm, but, after heaping these manifold disasters one upon another, the grim troop of Furies left the city and settled on the neck of the whole of Asia. These are the circumstances. Fate ordained that one Festus of Trent, a man of the lowest and most obscure origin whom Maximin loved like a brother because he was a comrade who had grown up with him, should cross over to the east, where as governor of Syria and master of the records he left behind him a good reputation for mildness and respect for the law. From this he was promoted to govern Asia with the status of proconsul, and the wind was set fair, as they say, to waft him to honour. Hearing that Maximin was set on the destruction of all respectable people, he decried his behaviour thenceforth as dangerous and disgraceful. But when he heard that the deaths of his victims had helped to advance his undeserving friend to a prefectship, he was on fire to imitate his conduct, and conceived similar hopes. Having adopted this pernicious policy, he suddenly changed masks like an actor, and stalked about with a grim and watchful look, confident that a prefectship would shortly be his if he too defiled himself with the blood of the innocent. Of all the various actions on his part which, to put it mildly, were excessively harsh, it will be enough to give a few examples which were matters of common knowledge and deliberate imitations of what had taken place at Rome. The principles governing good and bad action are the same everywhere, however much the circumstances may differ in importance. He executed a philosopher named Coranius, a man of no small merit, who held out under the most savage torture because in a private letter to his wife he had added in Greek, "Take note of what I say and put a wreath on the door." This is a proverbial expression signifying to the hearer that something of unusual importance is on foot. A simple-minded old woman, who was in the habit of using a harmless spell as a remedy for intermittent fevers, was put to death as a criminal, even though she had been called in to treat Festus' own daughter with his full concurrence. Among the papers of a respectable citizen which came to be examined in the course of business, the horoscope of a certain Valens was found. The man in question was asked why he had cast the nativity of the emperor. His defence against the false charge was that the Valens mentioned was his brother, who had long been dead. But although he undertook to prove this fully by irrefutable evidence, his judges would not wait to find out the truth, and he was scourged and slaughtered. A young man in the public baths was noted touching the marble of the bath and his own breast alternatively with the fingers of both hands, reciting the 7 Greek vowels as he did so. He believed that this would relieve a stomach complaint, but he was dragged into court, tortured, and beheaded. The cruelty and brutality of Valentinian in the West. At this point I turn my pen to Gaul, where there is much confusion about the order of events. Maximian, now prefect, is found at the centre of this cruel scene. His authority was extensive, and he exercised a sinister influence on the emperor, in whom unbounded caprice was united with supreme power. The reader who reflects on what I say must also bear in mind what I pass over in silence, and be understanding enough to pardon me if I do not include all of the instances in which deliberate wickedness exaggerated the gravity of alleged offences. Valentinian had naturally a savage temper, and passion, which is the enemy of sound reason, grew stronger in him after the arrival of Maximian. There was no one to give him better advice or to act as a restraining influence, and he allowed himself to drift on a stormy sea, as it were, from one act of cruelty to another. His very voice and expression, his gait and his complexion, changed when he was in a rage. Of this there are various indubitable examples, of which it will suffice to mention a few. A young man of the class known as pages was posted with a Spartan hound in leash, to watch for game. He let the dog slip before the proper moment, because the animal, in a struggle to get free, leapt upon him and bit him. For this he was cudgelled to death and buried the same day. The manager of a workshop brought the emperor a breastplate of most cunning workmanship, for which he expected to be paid. Valentinian, in an outburst of rage, ordered him to be put to death, because the finished product weighed slightly less than had been specified. An elder of the Christian Church from Epirus was executed because he failed to surrender the former proconsul Octavian, who had taken refuge with him, whereas the prime mover in the offence was sent back, though after some delay, to his home. Constantian, a riding master who had been sent to Sardinia to inspect cavalry mounts, took the liberty of exchanging a few of them, and was stoned to death at Valentinian's command. Athanasius, a popular charioteer, was the object of such suspicion to the emperor on account of his light-hearted jests, that orders were given that he should be burned alive if there was any more trouble. Shortly afterwards he was accused of practising sorcery and condemned to death at the stake. No indulgence was granted to a man who had given such general pleasure. Africanus, a busy Roman advocate and a provincial governor, aspired to be the ruler of another province. His request was supported by the master of cavalry Theodosius, who received this rough answer from the gracious emperor: "Go, Count, and change his head for him, since he wants to have his province changed." By this pronouncement a practised speaker lost his life, simply because he shared the common ambition for preferment. Two officers of the Joviani, Claudius and Solustius, who had reached the rank of tribune, were accused by a fellow whose mean origin was enough in itself to make him contemptible, of having spoken in favour of Procopius when he was a pretender to the throne. Although repeated inquiries brought nothing to light, the emperor ordered the master of cavalry who was hearing the case to send Claudius into exile and to pronounce a sentence of death on Solustius, coupling this, however, with a promise to reprieve the latter on the way to execution. These orders were obeyed, but Solustius did not escape death, and Claudius was not relieved from the misery of exile until after the decease of Valentinian. I shudder to recount all that took place, and I am afraid also of appearing deliberately to stress the defects of an emperor who was in other respects admirable. One thing, however, it would be wrong for me to pass over or suppress. He had two savage man-eating she-bears called Gold Dust and Innocence, to which he was so devoted that he had their cages placed near his bedroom, and appointed reliable keepers to see that nothing was allowed to impair the destructive fury of the brutes. In the end, after seeing many people buried whom Innocence had torn into pieces, he rewarded her services by returning her safely into the wild, in the hope that she would produce cubs like herself. Valentinian crosses the Rhine on a bridge of boats, but although Macrianus, the king of the Alemanni, was off his guard, he was prevented from capturing him through the fault of his soldiers. These then are undeniable indications of Valentinian's character and his bloodthirsty tendency, but on the other hand, no one, not even one of his persistent detractors, will reproach him with lack of ingenuity on behalf of the state, especially if one bears in mind that it was a more valuable service to check the barbarians by frontier defences than to defeat them in battle. But among many other cares, his first and principal aim was to capture alive by violence or by craft King Marcellinus, just as long before Julian took Vado Marius. For Marcellinus, amid the frequent changes in the policy followed towards him, had increased in power, and now was rising against our countrymen with full-grown strength, accordingly having first provided what the circumstances and the time demanded, and having learned from the reports of deserters where the said king, who expected no hostile move, could be seized, Valentinian threw a pontoon bridge across the Rhine as quietly as his means allowed, lest anyone should interfere with the bridge while it was being put together. And first, Severus, who commanded the infantry forces, took the lead by marching against Matasia Aquaia, but alarmed when he considered the small number of his soldiers, he halted, fearing he might be unable to resist the onrushing hordes of the enemy, and so might be overcome by them. There he chanced to find some of the traders loading slaves intended for sale, and because he suspected that they would quickly run off and report what they had seen, he took their wares from them and killed them all. Then the generals, encouraged by the arrival of additional troops, encamped with a view to a very short stay, since no one had a pack animal or tent except the emperor, for whom a rug and a rough blanket sufficed for such a shelter. Then, after delaying for a time on account of the darkness of night, as soon as the morning star uprose, since the campaign called for haste, they advanced further, led by guides who knew the roads, and a large force of cavalry was ordered to precede them and under the command of Theodosius, that nothing might be unobserved. Here there is a gap in the text. Was lying at the time, but he was prevented by the continuous noise made by his men, for although he constantly commanded them to abstain from plundering and setting fires, he could not make them obey, for the crackling flames and the dissonant shouts awakened the king's attendants, and suspecting what had happened, they placed him in a swift waggon, and hid him in a narrow pass of the precipitous hills. Valentinian was robbed of this glory not by his own fault or that of his generals, but by the indiscipline of his soldiers, which has often caused the Roman state heavy losses. So after reducing the enemy's territory to ashes for 50 miles, he returned sadly to Triers, there as a lion, because he had lost a deer or a goat, gnashes his empty jaws. Just when the forces of the enemy were broken and scattered by fear, in place of Marcellinus he made Marius king of the Bucinobantes, a tribe of the Alemanni dwelling opposite the river Mainz, and soon afterwards, since a recent invasion had utterly devastated the canton, he transferred him to Britain with the rank of tribune, and gave him command of a troop of the Alemanni, which at the time were distinguished for its numbers and its strength. Bithydius, indeed, and Horatius, chiefs of the same nation, he appointed to command in the army, but of these, Horatius was betrayed by a report of Florentius, commander in Germany, of having written certain things to the detriment of the state to Marcellinus and the chiefs of the barbarians, and also the truth was wrung from him by torture. After this he suffered the penalty of death by burning. Theodosius, commander of the cavalry in Gaul, in many battles exhausts the more Firmus, the son of Prince Nubal, who had revolted from Valentinian. After finally driving him to suicide, he restores peace to Africa. It has seemed best to give an account without a break of what happened next, lest while amongst matters and places widely separated, others are intruded, the survey of many varying events may invariably be confused. Nubal, as a petty king, had great power among the Moorish peoples. On departing from life, beside legitimate sons, he left some that were the offspring of concubines. Of the latter, Zamac, who was beloved by the general called Romanus, was secretly murdered by his brother Firmus, an act which occasioned dissensions and wars, for Romanus, hastening with extreme zeal to avenge his death, resorted to many formidable means for the destruction of the assassin, and as persistent rumours divulged, even at court vigorous measures were taken to make sure that the reports of Romanus, which heaped up many serious charges against Firmus, should be gladly received and read out to the emperor, and many voices united in supporting these reports. But on the contrary, the arguments which Firmus, through his friends, frequently presented in his defence for the purpose of saving his life, although they were received, were long concealed. For Remigius, at that time Marshal of the Court, a relative and friend of Romanus, declared that amid the more important and pressing business of the emperor, such trivial and superfluous communications could not be read until opportunity offered. When the Moor perceived that these things were being done to break down his defences, he was now in dread of the worst, and fearing that the rebuttal which he offered would be set aside and he would be executed without a trial as dangerous and unruly, he revolted from the rule of the empire and sought the help of neighbouring peoples. Here there is a gap in the text. To avert this danger before an implacable enemy should increase in strength, Theodosius, commander of the cavalry, was sent with the aid of a small body of the court troops, since in his merits as a man efficient in accomplishing his ends, he surpassed all others of this time. He might well be compared with Domitius Corbulo and Lucius of old, of whom the former under Nero, the latter during Trajan's reign, were famed for many brave deeds. Then setting out from Arles under favourable auspices and crossing the sea with the fleet under his command, preceded by no report of his coming, he landed on the coast of Sitifian, Mauritania. There he chanced upon Romanus, whom he addressed courteously, and sent him to take charge of the guards and frontier defences, with a very slight rebuke for his conduct, which made him apprehensive. When Theodosius had departed to Caesarean Mauritania, he sent Gildo, the brother of Firmus, and Maximus to arrest Vincentius, who was second in command to Romanus, participated in his insolence and thefts. Then, after being joined by his troops somewhat tardily, since they were delaying by the long sea voyage, he hastened to Sitifis, and gave orders that Romanus should with his attendants be handed over to the guard, to be kept in custody. During his stay in that town, Theodosius was torn with twofold anxiety, and turned over many things in his mind, considering by what way and by what devices he might lead his soldiers, who were accustomed to a cold climate, through lands parched with heat, or might capture an enemy who was a runabout, making sudden moves and trusting rather to secret ambuscades than to stand-up fights. When this first became known to Firmus, at first through uncertain rumours and then through definite information, overcome by the arrival of so brilliant a general, he sent envoys with a letter to ask pardon and indulgence for what had happened, declaring that he had not of his own volition taken a hasty step which he knew to be criminal, but because of unjust and outrageous treatment by Romanus, as he promised to show. When the general had read the letter, he accepted hostages and promised peace. He then proceeded to the station called Pancaria, in order to review the legions which were guarding Africa and had been bidden to assemble in that place. There he aroused the hope of all by a lofty but discreet address, and returned to Sitifis, where he united the native troops and those which he himself had brought. Then, impatient of further delay, he hastened with all speed to open the campaign. But among many other excellent measures, he made himself immensely more beloved by this, that he did not allow the provincials to furnish supplies for the army, declaring with splendid confidence that the harvests and stores of the enemy were the granaries of our valorous troops. After these arrangements had been made to the joy of the landowners, he marched to Tubus-Uptum, a town near Mount Ferratus, but declined to receive a second deputation from Firmus because, contrary to the previous agreement, it had brought no hostages with it. From there he carefully examined into everything so far as present circumstances allowed, and then advanced rapidly against the peoples of the Tindanes and the Marcellinus, who were provided only with light arms and were led by Mascizel and Dius, brothers of Firmus. When the enemy, active in all their limbs, were in sight, a fierce battle began after volleys of missiles from both sides. Amid the groans of the dying and the wounded, the mournful howls of the barbarians were heard, as they were taken prisoner or killed, and when the contest was ended, many fields were plundered and burned. Among such disasters conspicuous were those to an estate called Petronensis, which its owner, Salmaces, a brother of Firmus, had built up in the manner of a city, and which was utterly destroyed. The victor, elated by this success, with remarkable speed seized the town of Lamforctum, situated among the aforesaid peoples, where he caused an abundance of provisions to be stored, so that, if on penetrating further into the country he met with a scarcity of food, he might order it to be brought from near at hand. During the course of these events, Mascizel, having recovered his strength by bringing in helpers from neighbouring tribes, engaged with our men. But when very many of his troops were routed, he himself barely escaped the danger of death through the swiftness of his horse. Firmus, weakened by the losses of 2 battles and chafing in his innermost heart, in order not to neglect even one last measure, sent priests of the Christian sect with hostages to beg for peace. These were received courteously, and on their promise to furnish the necessities of life for the soldiers as was ordered, they brought back a favourable reply and peace, whereupon the Moor himself, after sending presents, went with some confidence to the Roman general, mounted upon a horse that would prove useful in times of danger, and when he had come near, dazzled by the gleaming standards and the fear-inspiring expression of Theodorus, he sprang from his mount, and with bowed neck, almost prostrate on the ground, blamed with tears his rashness and begged for pardon and peace. Being received with a kiss, since the interests of the state so demanded, he was now filled with joyful hope, and furnished a sufficient amount of provisions, then left some of his relatives by way of hostages, and went away, after agreeing to fulfil his promises and return the captives which he had taken at the very beginning of the rebellion. 2 days later, without hesitation, he restored, as had been ordered, the town of Icosium, of whose founders I spoke before, the military standards and the priestly crown, as well as the rest of the booty which he had taken. When after this our general had hurried through long marches and was now entering Tipasa, 2 envoys from the Mazaces, who had joined with Firmus and humbly begged for pardon, he replied with lofty spirit that he would at once take the field against them as traitors. And when they, paralysed with fear of the imminent danger, had been ordered to return to their homes, he went on to Caesarea, formerly a powerful and famous city, the origin of which I have also fully discussed in my description of the topography of Africa. on entering the city and finding it almost wholly burned down from widespread fires, and the paving stones white with mould, he decided to station the 1st and 2nd legions there for a time, with orders to clear away the heaps of ashes and keep guard there, to prevent the place from being devastated by a renewed attack of the savages. When these events had been spread abroad by frequent and trustworthy rumours, the officials of the province and the tribune Vincentius came out of hiding places in which they had taken refuge, and at last, free from fear, quickly appeared before the general. He, after having seen and received them gladly, being then still at Caesarea, inquired carefully about the true state of affairs. He learnt that Firmus, under pretence of fear and submission, was secretly forming the plan of throwing our army into confusion, as if by a sudden tempest, while it feared no hostile demonstration. Therefore he turned from there and came to the municipal town of Sagabaritanium on the slopes of the Troncelian mountains, where he found the horsemen of the 4th cohort of archers, who had gone over to the rebel, and to show that he was content with a somewhat mild punishment, he degraded them all to the lowest class of the service. Then he ordered them and a part of the Constantian infantry with their tribunes, one of whom had placed his neck chain in place of a diadem on Firmus' head, to come to Tigavi. While this was going on, Gildo and Maximus returned bringing Belus, one of the chiefs of the Mazaces, and Fericius, prefect of the tribe, who had aided the party of the disturber of the public peace. Here there is a gap in the text. When this had been done according to order, at daybreak he himself came out, and finding the rebels surrounded by his army, he said, "What think you, my devoted comrades, ought to be done with these abominable traitors?" And acceding to the acclamation of those who asked that they should pay for it with their blood, he turned over those who served among the Constantii to the soldiers, seem to be slain in the old-fashioned way. But he had the hands of the leaders of the archers cut off and punished the rest with death, following the example of the strictest of leaders, Curio, who put an end by a punishment of that kind to the wildness of the Dardani, when, like the Lorrainian Hydra, they constantly gained new life. But malevolent detractors, while praising the act of the olden time, find fault with this one as cruel and inhumane, declaring that the Dardani were murderous enemies, and justly suffered the punishment which befell them, while these, on the contrary, were soldiers under the flag, who had allowed themselves to commit a single fault, and deserved to have been punished more leniently. But such folk we remind of what they perhaps do not know, that this cohort was harmful not only in its actions but also in the example it set. The aforesaid Belis and Fericius, whom Gildo had brought, and Carandius, tribune of the archers, he ordered to be put to death, the last named on the ground that he never wished either to engage with the enemy himself or to encourage his men to fight. Moreover, Theodorus did this bearing in mind the saying of Cicero, "Wholesome strength is better than a vain show of mercy." Setting out from there, he came to an estate called Gaianatis, surrounded by a strong wall, and hence very safe as a refuge for the Moors. Against this he brought up his battering rams and destroyed it, including all of the inhabitants, and levelled the walls. Then, advancing over the Ancoranian mountain to Castellum Tingitanum, he attacked the Mazaces, who were gathered together into one body, and replied with missiles which came flying like hail. And after both sides had rushed to the attack, the Mazaces, though a warlike and hardy race, could not resist the columns of our men, charging with all their strength and weapons, but involved in heavy losses at various points, fled in shameful terror. And as they rushed to escape, all were cut down except those who found a means of getting away, and later, by abject prayers, obtained the pardon which circumstances made it advisable to grant. Here there is a gap in the text. Had succeeded Romanus, was ordered to go to Mauritania, in order to keep guard and prevent the province from being overrun, while he himself, encouraged by past successes, marched against the tribe of the Musones, which consciousness of their deeds of plunder and blood had joined with the enterprise of Firmus, since they hoped he would soon attain great power. Having advanced some distance near the municipal town of Ada Theodosius, learned that a great number of tribes, differing in civilization and in variety of language, but united in the purpose, were stirring up the beginnings of cruel wars, instigated and abetted through very great hope of rewards by a sister of Firmus named Syria, who, abounding in wealth and in feminine persistence, had resolved to make great efforts to aid her brother. Therefore Theodosius, fearing lest he should involve himself in an unequal contest, and if he confronted a vast horde with only a few troops, for he had under his command only 2,500 armed men, might lose them all, wavered between the shame of retreat and the desire for battle, but at last he gradually withdrew and made off, with the horde pressing at his heels. The foe, tremendously elated by this success, followed persistently. Here there is a gap in the text. So that he found necessary to fight, but he himself would have been killed and his army utterly annihilated, had not the enemy attacking in disorder seen afar off the auxiliaries of the Mazaces, in the van of which were some Romans. So thinking that they were attacking by many columns, they turned in flight and opened to our men ways of escape which had before been blocked. From there, leading his army safe and sound, Theodosius came to an estate called Marcellinus, where he burned a few deserters alive and mutilated the rest, as he had the archers whose hands were cut off. And in the month of February he reached Tipasa. There he made a long halt, and after the manner of the famous lingerer of old, took counsel with himself as the circumstances demanded, planning, if chance gave the opportunity, rather through strategy and discretion than by the danger of battle, to overthrow an enemy who was pugnacious and effective in the use of missiles. Nevertheless, he constantly sent men experienced in persuasion to the surrounding tribes, the Baiure Centurini, Avatomates, Cafaves, Bavares, and other neighbours, to entice them to an alliance, now by fear, now by bribes, sometimes by promising pardon for their impudence with, here there is a gap in the text, intending by subterfuges and delays to overcome an enemy who foiled all of his attacks, as Pompey once vanquished Mithridates. Therefore Firmus, to avoid imminent destruction, although he was protected by a strong body of troops, abandoned the army which he had got together at great expense, and when the quiet of night gave him the opportunity of concealment, he made his way into the far distant Caprarensian mountains, which are inaccessible because of their steep crags. In consequence of his secret departure, his army scattered and roamed about in small bands without a leader, thus giving our men the opportunity of invading their camp. After this was plundered, and those who resisted were killed or received in surrender, the greater part of the country was devastated, and our prudent leader put prefects of tried fidelity in charge of the peoples through whose country he was marching, The public enemy, terrified by this unexpected confidence of the pursuit, quickly departed, accompanied by a few slaves, in order to provide for his safety, and to prevent being impeded by any hindrance. He threw away packs containing valuable articles which he had carried off with him for his wife, worn out by continual hardships and by dangers. Here there is a gap in the text. Theodosius, sparing none of the enemy who came near, after refreshing his soldiers with better food and their pay, as well as disposing of the Caprerenses and their neighbours, the Abani, in slight skirmishes, hastened to the municipal town of Ordia, but having learned from trustworthy sources that the savages had already taken possession of hills which extended upwards in all directions in winding masses, and could be penetrated by no one except natives who were thoroughly acquainted with the locality, he retreated, and thereby, during the cessation of hostilities, brief though it was, gave the enemy an opportunity of being strengthened by very numerous auxiliaries from the Ethiopians who dwelt nearby. When their foe, with united forces and threatening uproar, taking no thought for their own lives, rushed into battle, they drove off Theodosius in great terror at the fearful sight of their countless throngs. But he took courage and at once returned, bringing an abundance of provisions, and with his men in close order, and brandishing their shields in a terrifying posture, met the enemy hand to hand. Then, although the bands of ravaging savages, blaring some ferocious tune on their barbaric trumpets, and also clashing their bucklers against their knees, were close upon them, nevertheless like a careful and discreet warrior, though distrusting the small numbers of his men, he formed a hollow square, and then advanced boldly. Then he fearlessly turned aside to a city called Conta, where Firmus, since it was a concealed and lofty fortress, had placed those of our men whom he had captured. But Theodosius recovered them all, and severely punished the traitors and the attendants of Firmus, as was his custom. While he was thus most successful, with the aid of the mighty Godhead, a trustworthy scout informed him that Firmus had fled to the Isaflenses, whereupon he invaded their lands to demand the traitor as well as his brother Mazaca and the rest of his kinsfolk. And when his demand was refused, he declared war upon that race. A fierce battle followed, since the savages were uncommonly ferocious, but he opposed his army to them in circular formation, and the Isaflenses were so overcome by the weight of the onrushing troops that many of them were slain. Firmus himself, after fighting bravely and often risking his life, was carried off in headlong flight by his horse, which was accustomed to run swiftly over rocks and crags, but his brother Mazacus was fatally wounded and taken prisoner. Theodosius gave orders to send Mazacus to Caesarea, a city on which the Moors had branded their savage marks by evil deeds, but he tore open his wound and died. However, his head was torn off, leaving the rest of his body intact, and to the great joy of all who saw it, was brought into the aforesaid city. After this, our famous general overcame the race of the Isaflanes, who still resisted, and, as justice demanded, inflicted many vexatious penalties upon them. There, Avancius, an important citizen, Florus his son, and some others, who were clearly convicted of having aided the violator of peace by secret counsel, were burned alive. Then Theodosius marched further into the country, and with great courage attacked the tribe of the Ibyolini, to which he had learned that Nubal, the father of Firmus, belonged, but he was brought to a halt by the high mountains and the circuitous passes, and although he attacked the enemy and after killing many of them opened a way, yet dreading the high hills, so well adapted to ambuscades, he led his men back in safety to the fortress Aduria. There the wild race of the Icelanzes voluntarily surrendered, promising to furnish aid and provisions. The mighty leader, exulting in these and similar glorious actions, then went in quest of the disturber of the peace himself, with a mighty effort of strength. To that end he made a long halt near the castle of Medianum, hoping that through many carefully devised plans Firmus might be betrayed into his hands. When he was looking forward to this with perplexed thoughts and deep care, he found that his enemy had returned to the Icelanzes, whereupon he did not delay as before, but attacked them with all the speed he could. Their king, Igmazen by name, who was highly regarded in those parts and notable for his resources, boldly came forward to meet him. "What is your rank?" he said, "or what have you come here to do? Tell me." Theodosius, with stern glances and resolute mind, replied, "I am the general of Valentinian, lord of the world, sent to destroy a murderous robber, unless you give him up at once to the invincible emperor. You will perish utterly with the race over which you rule." On hearing this, Igmazen, after heaping a flood of abuse upon the general, departed, full of wrath and resentment. At the first appearance of the following daylight, both armies, with threatening mien, advanced to meet each other in battle. Nearly 20,000 savages were stationed in the very van, with bands of reserves concealed behind them, in order that they might gradually rise up and surround our men with their unexpected numbers. Beside these there were a great many auxiliaries from the Icelanzes, who, as we have pointed out, had promised help and provision to our side. On the other hand, the Romans, although very few in number, nevertheless brave in spirit and encouraged by their former victories, passed side to side in close order, and with shields closely held together in tortoise formation, stood fast and resisted them, and the battle was continued from sunrise to the end of the day. A little before evening, Firmus was seen mounted on a tall horse, his purple cloak trailing out and spreading wide, urging out soldiers with loud shouts to take advantage of the opportunity and give up Theodosius if they wished to be saved from the dangers to which they were exposed, calling him a fierce savage and a cruel deviser of inhuman punishments. These unexpected words roused some to fight more fiercely, but induced others to abandon the battle. Accordingly, when the first quiet of night came, the landscape was wrapped in fear-inspiring darkness. The general returned to the stronghold of Duodia, and, reviewing his soldiers, rid himself by various forms of punishment of those whom panic and the words of Firmus had turned from their duty in the battle. Some had their right hands cut off, others were burned alive. And keeping watch by night with most vigilant care, he repulsed some of the barbarians who ventured to make an attempt on his camp after the setting of the moon, when they thought they could not be seen, or took prisoner those who rushed in table. Then, departing by quick marches and following bypaths, he attacked the Icelanzes from a quarter which they could not expect it, believing them to be of doubtful loyalty, and so devastated their lands that they were reduced to dire need. Then he returned by way of the towns of Mauritania to Sisyphus, where he tortured to the verge of death and then burned alive Castor and Marcellinus as sharers in the robberies and atrocities of Romanus. After this, the war with the Icelanzes was renewed, and when in the first engagement great numbers of the savages were put to flight or killed, their king, Igmazen, who had before been accustomed to victory, wavering through fear of the present danger, and thinking that because of his unlawful associations no hope of life was left to him if he made obstinate resistance, he rushed forth alone and with all possible caution and secrecy from the scene of the battle. When he came into the presence of Theodosius, he humbly begged that the general would order Marcella, a chief of the Mazaces, to appear before him. When Messala had been sent to Theodosius as he had asked, the king, through him, in a secret interview, urged the general, who by his own nature was inclined to resolution, that in order to provide himself with the means of accomplishing his desires, he should vigorously assail his fellow countrymen, and by constant fighting reduce them to fear. He said that they were indeed inclined to favour the public enemy, but were wearied by their many losses. Theodosius did as he was advised, and so wore out the Isflenses by frequent contests, that they were falling like cattle, and Firmus for this secretly escaped, intending to hide in remote and lasting retreats. But while he was there planning flight, he was taken prisoner by Igmazen and kept in custody. And since he had learned through Massalia of the secret negotiations, he saw that in his extremity only one remedy was left, and decided by a voluntary death to spurn with his foot the desire to live. Accordingly, having purposely filled his gods and made them drunk, and in the silence of the night they were buried in sound sleep, he himself, kept awake by fears of the trouble which hang over him, with noiseless steps left his bed, by creeping on hands and knees, got himself some distance off, and finding a rope which he had procured for the calamity of ending his life, he hung himself from a nail fastened in the wall, and putting his neck in it, breathed his last without the torments of a painful death. This event troubled Igmazen, who lamented that he had been robbed of glory in not having had the good fortune of bringing the usurper alive to the Roman camp. Therefore, after gaining a public pledge of safety through Messala, he placed the corpse of the dead man on his camel to bring it in, and on reaching the tents of the army, which were pitched near the fortress of Saburca, he transferred the body to a pack animal, and himself offered it to the exultant Theodosius. The latter came together with his soldiers, and with them the populace, and asked them whether they recognized the features. And when he had learned beyond all doubt that this was the face of Firmus, after a brief stay there, he returned to Sisyphus in the guise of a triumphing general, where he was received with applause and commendation by all of every age and rank. Invasion of Pannonia by the Quadi and the Sarmatians. While Theodosius was labouring through the dust of his campaign in Mauritania and Africa, the Quadi, who had long been quiet, suddenly caused an upheaval. They are a people who nowadays inspire little fear, but were formerly immensely warlike and powerful. This is shown by the sudden raids that they made, by the siege of Aquileia, in which they were joined by the Marcomanni, by the destruction of Opitergium, and by many bloody feats in the course of a lightning campaign when they crossed the Julian Alps, and the Emperor Marcus, of whom I have spoken earlier, was hardly able to withstand them. On this occasion they had what for barbarians was a just ground for complaint. Valentinian, from the very beginning of his reign, was burning with a glorious resolve to protect his frontiers. But he went too far when he ordered the erection of a fortress on the further side of the Danube and in the actual territory of the Quadi, which he treated as subject to the authority of Rome. This infringement on their rights was resented by the inhabitants, but for the moment they did nothing beyond sending a delegation and grumbling. Maximian, however, always on the lookout for a chance to do wrong and unable to bridle his natural arrogance, which was further swollen by his promotion to prefect, blamed Equitius, the commander-in-chief in Illyricum, for obstinacy and slackness in not completing the work which he had orders to hurry on. He added with an appearance of public spirit that if his own son Marcellian were made general in Valeria, the fortress would rise from the ground without any further shilly-shallying. Both his wishes were soon fulfilled. The newly appointed general arrived on the scene and acted with the untimely presumption to be expected of his father's son. Without making any attempt to placate the people who were being driven from their country to further a novel and illusory scheme, he took in hand the works that had been recently begun and then suspended to allow opportunity for protest. Finally, when King Gabinius made a modest request that no further steps should be taken, he gave the impression that he would agree, and with feigned friendliness invited Gabinius and others to a dinner. But as his unsuspecting guests were leaving, he had them murdered, a most infamous violation of the sacred laws of hospitality. The news of this outrage at once got abroad and roused the Quadi and the neighbouring tribes to fury. Mourning the death of their king, they got together and sent out parties to devastate our territory. They crossed the Danube and fell upon the country folk, who were busy with their harvest, and had not thought of an enemy. Most of them they killed, and the rest they carried off home together with a large quantity of livestock. An irreparable atrocity was narrowly avoided, which would have found a place among the most shameful episodes in Roman history. The daughter of Constantius, who was on her way to be married to Gratian, was nearly captured when she was taking a meal on a crown estate called Prista, but by the mercy of heaven the governor of the province, Messala, was at hand. He put her in an official carriage and conveyed her at a gallop to Sirmium, 26 miles away. By this lucky chance the princess was saved from the danger of slavery. If she had been captured and it had proved impossible to ransom her, deep disgrace would have been branded on the state. After this, the Quadi, together with the Sarmatians, both peoples addicted to rape and brigandage, extended their depredations, carrying off men, women, and livestock, and gloating over the ashes of burnt farms, and the sufferings of the murdered inhabitants, whom they took by surprise and slaughtered without mercy. Fear of a similar fate spread over the neighbouring districts. The Praetorian prefect Probus, who was quite unused to the horrors of war and was then at Sirmium, was so overcome by this novel and melancholy experience that he could hardly raise his eyes from the ground, and was long in doubt what to do. He had a team of swift horses got ready, and decided to fly the following night, but then thought better of it, and stayed where he was. He realised that everybody within the walls would follow him and make for a handy place of refuge, and that if this happened the town would be left defenceless to fall into the enemy's hands. So he mastered his fears and roused himself by a strong effort to meet the crisis. He cleared out the moats which were choked with rubbish and indulged his native taste for building by raising the greater part of the walls, which had been neglected and allowed to decay owing to the long peace. Even high towers with battlements were now erected, and the works were quickly finished, because he found the materials collected some time before to build a theatre would suffice for the purpose. This admirable plan was supplemented by another useful measure. He sent for a detachment of archers from the nearest post to help in the siege, if this should take place. These obstacles were enough to discourage the barbarians from attacking the city. They were unskilled in the sophisticated type of warfare of sieges, and hampered by their loads of booty, so they turned instead to the pursuit of Aquitius. They learned from some of their prisoners that he had withdrawn into the remotest parts of Valeria and hurried after him. What particularly enraged them, and made them eager to cut his throat, was a belief that he was responsible for entrapping their innocent king. When this became known, 2 legions, the Pannonian and the Mosian, were sent in all haste to bring them to battle. They constituted an adequate force, and would undoubtedly have come off victorious if they had acted in concert, but their efforts to come to grips with the plunderers separately were frustrated by a quarrel which arose between them over points of honour and precedence. This did not escape the keen eyes of the Sarmatians, who, without waiting for the customary signal, attacked the Mosians first. In their confusion, our men were slow to get their weapons in order and suffered heavy losses. Then, with increased confidence, the enemy broke through the line of the Pannonians. Our whole force was thrown into disorder and would have been almost entirely annihilated by repeated assaults if some had not saved themselves from imminent death by flight. While fortune was inflicting these sad losses on our general in Mosia, the younger Theodosius, who later proved a most admirable emperor, but at that time had barely reached manhood, inflicted several defeats on the free Sarmatians, so called to distinguish them from their rebellious slaves, who were invading our territory on the other side. Though their converging hosts put up an obstinate resistance, he crushed them so completely in one fight after another that birds and beasts of prey were surfeited by a regular banquet on the bodies of the slain. In consequence, the remainder lost heart. They were afraid that a general of such obvious promptitude and valour would overwhelm or rout their invading bands on the very frontier, or else ambush them from the cover of the woods. So after many vain attempts to break through, they abandoned hope of success and sued for pardon and forgiveness of their past offences. For the time being they were conquered and did nothing to violate the terms of the peace granted to them. What particularly alarmed them was the arrival of a strong force of Gallic troops for the defence of Illyricum. While all these disturbances were taking place, the Tiber, which intersects the Eternal City and receives the effluent of many drains and streams before it empties into the Tyrian Sea, was swollen by excessive rainfall during the prefecture of Claudius. It no longer looks like a river, and flooded almost the entire neighbourhood. All the districts of the city which extended over low-lying grounds were under water. Only the hills and the higher blocks of dwellings were out of danger. The height of the flood made movement on foot impossible, but many deaths from starvation were averted by the conveyance of abundant supplies of food in boats and weirs. But when the weather moderated and the river, which had broken its banks, returned to its normal bed, men's fears were banished and no further trouble was expected. The term of office of the prefect passed in complete quiet, and was free from any disturbance that went beyond the bounds of reasonable complaint. He restored many old buildings and, among other projects, erected a large colonnade near the baths of Agrippa. This was called the Colonnade of Good Success, because there is a temple to that deity to be seen nearby.